See, today there is cultural amnesia. The tragedy is that the educated in India are far removed from any knowledge of their culture, which is significant.
Like Pakistan is thoroughly confused. They have changed their fathers 3 times in the last 75 years. First they said they're descendants of Arabs, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Then they started saying they're descendants of Persians. Now they say they're descendants of Turks. They're insufficiently imagined. They don't know who they are. The only way they define themselves is that they are not India. Lamo ne khata ki, saziyon ne saza pai. People have heard that. If we make that mistake at this time, our generations will suffer. The only ones who will defeat us Indians are we Indians ourselves. We shouldn't be divided.
The burden and the challenge of actually reaching the masses lies much more heavily on the professional historian. Many of us feel actually from time to time rather frustrated that how do we get historical correctives out to the masses, and yet doing so in a way that does not dumb down our history.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. I offer a very humble and delighted good morning and namaste to all of you. My name is Dr. Bhagyeshri Trivedi, and I feel I am absolutely honored to be sharing this space today with 3 stalwarts in the field of intelligentsia, history and culture. I think they are 3 people who have not only shaped the way the world looks at India, but also the way India looks at itself. And I thank the Indraprastha Cultural Festival for inviting me to be a part of this stimulating conversation with them. So namaste to all the panelists. As we open the Indraprastha Cultural Festival, we begin with the fundamental question: what is culture? What does a festival like this revolve around? Where do we locate it and how do we define it? More importantly, we also ask, why is it important to pose such questions today? Culture as a term is as evasive as it is pervasive. Perhaps one of the most ubiquitous terms used by human communities for self-fashioning. It is a frame we use to talk about how we dress, what we eat, how we interact, or perhaps why we don't interact with each other. At a subtler level, culture is something that might frame our belief systems, anchor our values, and broaden or limit our perceptions. Although practiced in individual gestures, its existence is a priori communitarian. So how do we tackle this paradox of culture? So is culture then just a narrative? Is it just a question of what story do I choose to tell to create a perception about myself? And therefore, is culture so embattled? Who decides which narrative dominates when? Who owns this narrative? And whether it is the state or the people who anchor it. Whose story becomes important when and how? And if culture is just a story, then is it simply a matter of collective memory? Is it just a shared history of how a community was born, it thrived, and it defended itself in the civilizational histories of the world? Does that make culture the central marker of identity, a modality of defining oneself? And what is the role of language in narrativizing this memory? What happens when we reimagine Delhi as Indraprastha? And then what of cultural amnesia? What happens when this memory is discredited, discarded, or demolished? And what do we even mean by culture when we use it in the context of rights? Does it mean that culture has an inherent connection with a land or geography? And if the location of culture is crucial to exercising cultural rights, how does culture define itself beyond the boundaries of the land that it purportedly originates in? And what of the culture of those who are displaced? What happens to the victims of persecution, wars, or partitions? What does culture mean to such communities? That is, does it thrive in exile? Or does it only survive in the heirlooms that they manage to rescue, the art that capture their mythologies, the foods on their plate, or the rituals they practice? In such contexts, does culture become something static like an artifact in a museum, the relic of some past glory? Is culture something that is frozen in time, like those monuments that stand testimony to a bygone history? Is it like those ancient places of worship that paradoxically anchor an ancient identity while also framing present practices? What of cultural appropriation, cultural renaissance, cultural revival? Does it mean there is some inherent core, a set of immanent values and beliefs that can be borrowed or revived? Or is culture trapped in a definitional stalemate? And finally, what of the word culture itself? Are we invoking the same idea when we use the words culture and Samskriti, or are they invoking different tapestries? It is with these questions that I open this panel discussion, and now I give the floor to the panelists, beginning with Ambassador Varma. I request each one of them to present their views on the idea.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be with all of you today discussing an important subject, culture. This is a subject which we often take for granted. We are one of the world's oldest cultural civilizations, which we are. But that assumption must, in my view, in order to allow that very culture which we have inherited to further grow and blossom, that knowledge should be with us also. So I'm not getting into the definition of culture. Culture is a way of life. It's a corpus. It is a practice, a way of living. It is a theory. It is application. It is unique. Our culture is defined by, in my view, antiquity, continuity, peaks of refinement, assimilation, and diversity. And it's a journey that is probably 8 to 10,000 years old or more. Today, with the redating of the Rig Veda, we know that perhaps Indian culture is among the oldest cultures in the world. The Rig Veda, which is the first recorded text we have from this great cultural legacy, is now dated somewhere around 3,500 to 4,000 BCE and not 1500 as was taught to us by the British. And there was an Aryan invasion and the Dravidian population was overwhelmed, and that happened sometime in 1500 BCE. All of this is now in the garbage bin of history. As new research, new scientific data shows us that because of that elusive river called Saraswati, and I don't have the time to go into it, that the Aryans were here as far back as about 4000 BC. The Rig Veda was written then. And if this culture is that old, there is a paradox before us. One is that it's one of the oldest cultures. And one is much later, the intervening period of colonialism. Now, post-colonial societies suffer from a word you use called cultural amnesia. In other words, the whole purpose of successful colonialism is to gradually make the people they rule adrift from their cultural roots and become mirror images of the kind of culture the rulers represent. And perhaps there was no colonial precedent as successful as that of the British. Nothing could be clearer when Macaulay said it. In 1835, we want to create clones who are black in color, but who are our mirror images. First of all, as the Secretary General of UNESCO once told me, the first thing the colonial master does is to take away your language. सबसे पहले तो आप किसी से हिंदी में सवाल पूछिए, वो जवाब अंग्रेजी में देगा कि आप ये ना समझें कि मुझे अंग्रेजी नहीं आती है. In other words, there is a status attached to English, which is, I have nothing against it, but that is happening in a country which must have the world's largest linguistic diversity. Imagine for yourself, in sub-Saharan Africa, there is only one country with a written script, Ethiopia. And here we have 24 languages with not only their own script, but a vocabulary and corpus that goes back millennia. I mean, Tamil is as old as many claim as Sanskrit itself. तो इस देश में one is the pauperization of our interest in our own languages. आज इंडियन कल्चर पर बात हो रही है तो माध्यम आपने भी शुरू ऐसे ही किया, अंग्रेजी है. और मैं अंग्रेजी की कोई खिलाफत नहीं करता, मैंने खुद भी अपनी किताबें अंग्रेजी में लिखी है, उनका अनुवाद हुआ है. बट दिस इज द फर्स्ट थिंग दैट हैपेंस. The second thing we have to understand about our culture is that its foundations were based on the principle of maulik soch, the power of original thought. And maulik soch can only happen when there is an atmosphere of openness, inquiry, interrogation and dialogue. तो मैं आपको दो छोटे स्टैंजा पढ़ रहा हूं, नसीदिया सूक्त, which is from the Rigved. तो उसमें, now imagine the tone of this. There was neither non-existence nor existence then. There was neither the realm of space nor the sky which is beyond. What stirred? Where? In whose protection? There was neither death nor immortality then. There was no distinguishing sign of night or day. That one breathed. Who really knows? Who will here proclaim it? Whence was it produced? Whence is this creation? Whence this creation has arisen? Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down in it, in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not know. ये नसीदिया सूक्त है. अब आप देखिए इसमें प्रश्न ज्यादा है. There are more questions asking what could be the truth. See the great foundations of your culture. It is not saying this is the truth. It is ruminating. It is ideation. It is exploration. It is interrogation. It is a quest to find out what could be the truth rather than to proclaim prematurely, this is the truth. And that is why in the 6 systems of Hindu philosophy, you can almost call them atheist. They don't refer to God except partially in the yoga. Nyaya, Vaisheshik, Sankhya, Yoga, Purv Mimansh, Uttar Mimansh. We have 6 systems of Hindu philosophy. They are not talking of God. They are talking of what could be the ultimate truth behind the bewildering plurality of this cosmos. Satya kya hai? And that is why among the Mahavakyas of the Upanishads, when I joined the Raj Sabha and entered Parliament, the first thing you do as you enter the gate, Amish, is Udara Charitanam Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam. Imagine the audacity of thought. At a time when people were settling down in small habitations and their leaders were proclaiming that only we matter. Here our sages were saying at that time, for the big-hearted, the whole world is a family. It's the audacity of thought. Soch ki parakashta hai. It is only in such a cultural civilization that you can have another Mahavakya which says, Ekam sat vipraha bahuda vadanti. And here our sages were saying as a Mahavakya, the truth is one, wise people call it by different names. And it is again, this explains why in our tradition we have another Mahavakya. Ano Bhadra Kritavo Yantu Vishvata. The same set of circumstances apply to this Mahavakya also. जब लोग दीवारें, दरवाजे और खिड़कियां बंद करके ये कहते थे कि हमें बाहर की चीजें नहीं सुननी है और जो हम सोचते हैं वही सत्य है, हमारे जो सोचने वाले थे, जो विचारक थे, वो कह रहे थे लेट गुड थॉट्स फ्लो टू अस फ्रॉम ऑल डायरेक्शंस. एंड दैट्स व्हाई वी हैव इन इंडिया द क्रेडल ऑफ सो मेनी रिलीजन्स. I mean, I see Sikhism. It's Vedantic. अव्वल अल्लाह, नूर उपाया, कुदरत के सब बंदे, एक नूर से सब जग उपजा, कौन भला कौन बंदे. It's amazing. There's Allah in it. Later in the same Shabad there is Ram. And yet it's Sikhism with its great tradition of chanting, japna, kirat karna, vand khana. So what I'm trying to say is that one last thing I'll say and I'll finish in 1 minute. See, today there is a big problem. I started with cultural amnesia. In this background of such a great culture which has evolved over the years with many other important assimilations, the tragedy is that the educated in India are far removed from any knowledge of their culture, which is significant. जब मैंने अपनी किताब आदि शंकराचार्य पे लिखी, हिंदुइज्म ग्रेटेस्ट थिंकर, मुझसे बहुत से एजुकेटेड लोगों ने पूछा ये किस पीरियड, व्हेन डिड ही लिव, व्हाट डिड ही राइट? People don't know. And that is the tragedy. People don't know that in a variety of fields, Sanskrit, grammar, physics, astronomy, astrology, poetics, literature, art, dance, mathematics, we were not, हम photocopy नहीं थे, we were the original. Nobody respects photocopies. We have to become the original. Bharat ne Natya Shastra, he wrote it 600 years before the birth of Christ. It is not a manual on the arts. It is the meditation on what constitutes aesthetics, rasa. At that time, in many parts of the world, people had not come down from trees. 6,000 shloks. लोगों ने पढ़ा नहीं है, हमारे स्कूल करिकुलम में नहीं है, और हम कल्चर की आज यहाँ बैठ के बात कर रहे हैं, तो मैं कभी कभी सोचता हूं कि without this knowledge, how can we be rooted in our soil? Because cultures are opaque and cultures are unique, and what makes them are the people who are part of the culture. Then they become brand ambassadors of their culture in an open, eclectic, tolerant but convincing way to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Now I request Professor Kaul to kindly proceed with her presentation.
Namaskar. It's a great pleasure to be speaking here today in this distinguished panel and addressing all of you in a very dynamic festival, the Indraprastha festival. Now, the theme of our session today asks, is culture narrative? Is it identity or is it artifact? And my first response is, these are not three mutually exclusive categories at all. If anything, they are mutually constitutive, which is to say that identities typically emerge from the process of narrativization, be it textual representations, mythology, visual culture, the arts, folk songs, and so on and so forth. And these narratives often congeal around or grow around what we understand as artifacts. So I'm treating the word artifact rather broadly, not necessarily as objects at all, but civilizations do cherish certain attributes, certain beliefs, certain practices, certain values and meanings above others. And this then becomes a center, a sort of orienting principle for a variety of narratives and the identities that are born of them. In fact, the technical definition of culture in a field like anthropology, which works rather closely with culture, though in some would argue in questionable ways and methods when it comes to non-Western civilizations, but nonetheless, they offer a rather useful definition of culture, which is a simple one too. That culture is essentially shared meanings and values. And I believe a lot of my work in the last 25 years and the 9 books that I've authored, some of which are available here, and it would give me great satisfaction if those of you interested would actually want to flip through those. I believe a lot of my concern in history as a historian of early India has been precisely to investigate what are those values and meanings that were cherished by our civilization, our culture over the millennia before the colonial disjuncture. Speaking of which brings me to my second point. It is precisely the reclamation of these endemic, local, endogenous narratives, identities, meanings, and values that is at the heart of what I think Ambassador Pavan Varma ji was also referring to, which is called intellectual decolonization. Now, that's a word we are hearing a lot about these days, but as he very rightly said, if we don't have the fundamentals in place, such as, for example, an authentic, accurate, and rigorous understanding of our history and a knowledge of our languages, without these skills, how can we even begin to contemplate a project of decolonization if we have to go beyond the slogan to the actual substance of what this might involve? Internationally, the same phenomenon would be also known as the Global South movement, which is then not just about India, but India located within a larger committee of nations, non-Western nations that also happen to have undergone colonialism. Now, what is this Global South movement? It is essentially all about embracing and foregrounding local worldviews, local ways of seeing, of being, of knowing in the non-West. And I might quickly add here, West doesn't only indicate a cardinal direction. West here really stands for a mindset. So if you ask me, I would dare say if you ask me to define culture, I think my favorite would be to say that it is ways of knowing and being that are common to a people. So to throw a little bit of jargon in, epistemologies and ontologies that are common to a people and valued by a people. Now, third, and the final, and somewhat longish segment of my opening comments, what if we were to attempt a bit of this cultural reclamation right here, right now? Where would we start? Where should we start? This is a festival on Indraprastha, which happens to be the capital of Bharat in ancient times. So I put to you that perhaps there is no better place than exploring the idea of India itself. Let's begin with that. What is the understanding of Indian culture in the past? Now, of course, this is as vast and objective as they can be, and there's no way we can actually attempt all of it in this talk, but let's see what we can get from just a handful of literary testimonies from the ancients, from the pre-moderns. The first would be the magnificent Mahabharata, very conservatively dated to the 5th century BCE in modern academics. But of course, again, as Pavanji hinted, there is a much longer chronology that tradition attributes to the Mahabharata that would take it to at least 3000 BCE. Now, what does this master text of Indian civilization tell us about India and Indian culture? The Bhishma Parva of the Mahabharata, in its 10th chapter, details what Bharatvarsha is in more than 70 verses. So a very self-conscious engagement with selfhood, with what makes Bharat, Bharat. what do these verses tell us? First, they document all the many mountains and mountain ranges that you can think of in the Indian subcontinent, from the north to the south, the east to the west, going up to the northeast as well. And the many rivers that crisscross this country. I'm not naming them, but they do occur in very recognizable terms and names in the text. So what is happening? What do we find here? That there is a place and culture consciousness in India from the beginning that is deeply ecologically aware and ecologically embedded. It conceives of selfhood as something that is rooted in the very land of Bharat. The text doesn't stop at that. It goes on to actually document a thorough ethnography of Bharatvarsha. That is, all the variegated communities, the janas is the term used, that peopled Bharatvarsha, right from Kashmiris in the north. Yes, you heard it right. Kashmiris are understood to be a part of Bharatvarsha from one of the earliest articulations of Bharat itself. Through Punjab, Vidarbha, Malava in central India, Odisha, Bengal and Assam in the east, to Dravida, Kerala, Karnataka, Kuntala, which is understood to be modern Telangana, and the Cholas in the south. Mlechas and Yavanas. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these terms from ancient India, but they broadly stood for outsiders. Even they are named as residents of Bharatvarsha, as belonging to Bharatvarsha. And so are the Vanavasis, the forest-dwelling tribes, the Atavikas, to use that a more appropriate term. These are the Nishadas, the Shabaras, the Kiratas, the Abhiras. All of them are mentioned as residents of Bharatvarsha, belonging to Bharatvarsha. And there is an explicit reference to Bharatvarsha as the land of all four Varnas. This is a land for all. So, what am I getting at? A very inclusive and plural idea of Bharatvarsh as a culture that you find in the Mahabharata. So we don't need lessons in multiculturalism from any country in the world today. This has been our lived and much cherished reality right from the beginning of historical documentation. In fact, a moment to applaud this cultural trait, because it really is remarkable for a culture to simultaneously and so robustly maintain its faith in the many and the one. Because the articulations of Bharat, that there may be many kingdoms, many janas, many people, but they are all Bharat, is a recurrent articulation in all these texts. I'm citing only 4 today, but there are nearly 40 in my book called Bharat Before the British. And in some senses, it's an incomplete picture to just talk about a few. But certainly in the Mahabharata, this picture emerges that Bharatiya culture emerges here as that singularity that encompassed rather than erased the many. So there is no fight between the unity of Bharata and its internal endemic diversity. Both are acknowledged by our sources and celebrated. I need to rush to the next. The Vishnu Mahapuran, 5th century CE, continues this story in its famous verse, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this. Uttaram yat samudrasya himadreschaiv dakshinam varsham tad bharatam nam bharati yatra santatihi. So it's actually giving a name to those who reside in Bharatvarsha. It is asserting an identity for them, whose children, the nation whose children, santatihi, are called Bharati. And that is indeed the name that continues to be what we call ourselves by. So incredible continuity, civilizational continuity. The Vishnu Puran also says that Bharatvarsh is the only country in the world which is karma bhumer iyam, which is the land of karma. That is, that this is the land where you can actually make your own destiny through your own actions. And I dare say, dharma and karma are outstanding orienting features of Indic culture across the millennia. But I have to move on to the next example. Xuan Sang is the 7th century Chinese Buddhist pilgrim who comes to India, and he's standing at a place called Nagarahara, which is modern Jalalabad in Afghanistan, west of the Khyber Pass, and he says, I'm standing at the gateway to Indu. Now, Indu is the name that he tells us is for India. He also explains to you why this is the name for India. He says there are different names for India, but Indu is the favorite among Indians. And what is the explanation he gives? He says because Indu is the Sanskrit word for moon. And like the moon, India is luminous, is resplendent. Thanks to what? Thanks to the collective glow of its many rishis, its sages. So learning and a deep spirituality are seen as outstanding features of Indian culture in the eyes of this foreign traveler and seeker. Finally, I want to quote a 14th century, second generation Turkish immigrant to India and his experience of this land and culture. I'm speaking of the poet Amir Khusro. He writes in his No Sipir, his composition, a eulogy to the culture of what he calls Hind. So I have argued in my book that there may be multiple names by which India is called over 2,000 years, but the understanding of what it was actually remains remarkably continuous and clear. That's a different point. What does he tell us about Hind? He first cites Hind's linguistic diversity. Again, something Pavan was talking about. More than a dozen languages that he calls Hindavi. And he names many of them. The first he chooses to name is Sanskrit, which he describes as the pearl amongst pearls. And Chetas and I hope we can talk a little more about Sanskrit in the conversation to follow. But he also names again Kashmiri as an Indian language, as a Hindavi. He names Bengali, Gujarati, Sindhi, Kannada, Tamil, and so on and so forth. What else does he say? He calls India Firdaus, that is paradise on earth, and is explicit in saying that India is far superior to other countries due to various things, such as the climate, such as its fertility, blah, blah, but mostly due to its incomparable intellectual wealth, a lot of which Khusro attributes to the sheer prodigiousness of Sanskrit. Khusro says the world's scholars come to India to gain knowledge, but Indians have no need to go to the world for the same. Now, scholars have typically seen this as a sign of insularity, that Indians were an insular culture. They didn't want to go out into the world. But Khusro is telling us something very different. He is saying this is cultural superiority, that we didn't actually even need to bother with the world, whereas they were all coming here. He goes on to name all the knowledge systems that thrived in India, in Hind, affirming that India invented the numerals, ironically today known as the Arabic numerals. He says we invented the zero, the game of chess, shatranj. He singles out for mention Indian music, animals, and feminine beauty. And finally he writes, and I'll conclude with these words. He writes, quote, "How great is this land, which produces men who deserve to be called men. There cannot be a greater teacher than the way of life of the people here. It is the gift of the Almighty, this cultural environment, very rare in other countries, so that if perchance any Iranian, Greek, or Arab comes by, he will not lack for anything, because they will treat him as their own." Unquote. Need I say more? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaul. Now, of course, I invite Amish ji to kindly share his views on the subject, and that we'd love for your perspectives to engage with each other.
Yeah, I think I'll just speak from here. I know there's very little time left, so I'm just gonna be quick in what I say. We have spoken of India being the only pre-Bronze Age civilization that is still alive. Let's explore what this means through a pop quiz. My wife and I were in Egypt recently, and I was just asking people around, my tour guide, everyone, that what is the ancient name of Egypt? What did your Egyptian ancestors call Egypt? Only one person gave me the right answer. He was an academic, so I would have expected it. Anyone wants to take a guess? What did the ancient Egyptians call themselves? Misra. Many people said that. That's actually not correct. Misra is the Aramaic or the Arabic word. So there are two languages, Aramaic and Arabic, which is what they called Egypt. I'm talking about what did the Egyptian ancestors themselves call their own country 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. Does anyone know? Take a guess. I'm not surprised that people in India wouldn't know. What shocked me is most Egyptians didn't know. It was actually Khem. That's what Egyptians called themselves 3,000 years ago. What did our ancestors call ourselves 3,000 years ago? Bharat. What did our ancestors call ourselves 5,000 years ago? What do we call ourselves today? That is continuity. Right? What does this translate into? Look, empires are built on force, on violence. That's how empires are built. Civilizations are built on stories, on culture, on narratives, on what you find beautiful, on how you engage with each other. Empires can rise and fall. The Mauryas came and went. The Guptas came and went. Even those who invaded us came and went. The Timurid Mughals came and went. But the civilization of Bharat is still here. It is the stories that we tell ourselves. It is what we think who we are. It is what we find tasty. It is what we find beautiful. It is what we think is the proper way to behave with each other. In the West, a kid touching his parents' feet is like he'll be looked at, ye kya kar raha hai? In India, it's natural. It's what you do. A kid not doing it is rude. Right? It's what we tell each other what is the right way to behave. That's what civilization and culture is. But why is storytelling that much more important? Because it's not just about how we tell ourselves who we are. It's also about how we engage with the world. How did we survive these centuries of civilizations, of invasions? Because we knew what we had to do, who we had to fight with, who could be a potential ally. Think about how our independence movement people, right, our leaders, they were great thinkers as well. They thought deeply about what kind of nation India should be. They weren't just thinking about tomorrow. They were thinking about the day after tomorrow, right? Once we become independent, what should we be like? What social reform should there be? How should we engage with each other? And there are various ideas of India in this. The Dr. Ambedkar idea of India, the Mahatma Gandhi idea of India, the Nehruvian idea of India, the Sardar Patel idea of India, the Veer Savarkar idea of India, and all of them will keep debating, which is a good thing, which is the Indian way. But the fact that we thought deeply, that our leaders thought deeply about how we should engage with each other, what our civilization means, what our culture means, ensured that when we became independent, we had an idea of what we had to do. If a country does not think about its own culture, if it does not think about who it is, who are we, where have we come from, where are we going, then you are an insufficiently imagined country, like Pakistan is thoroughly confused. I've met a lot of Pakistanis when I was in India. It's difficult to meet Pakistanis, but when I was in the UK, they have changed their fathers 3 times in the last 75 years. First, they said they're descendants of Arabs, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Then they started saying they're descendants of Persians. Now they say they're descendants of Turks. They're insufficiently imagined. They don't know who they are. The only way they define themselves is that they are not India. They are not Hindu. And there's this wonderful line that I read somewhere that if a Turk gives up Islam, he's still Turk. If an Arab gives up Islam, he's still Arab. Whereas a Pakistani gives up their version of Islam, they're Indian. Right? That's what troubles them the most. And Pakistan for us is an example. I'm not saying hate them. Hate is too strong an emotion. Don't waste things like that. Right? But Pakistan is an example of what happens to nations who don't think about who are we, who don't have good answers for this, who don't have good debates for this. And I think the Indians of today, all of us, particularly the kids, those of you who are philosophers, those of you who are storytellers, think deeply about the stories that are important to us, the culture, what does our culture mean? What does our identity mean? What does our narrative mean? And have those debates, right? Because this is a time of massive geopolitical change once again. After the Second World War, that order is breaking down. It's going to be 5-10 years of chaos. The youngsters among today, I'm sorry, much of your working life will go in this chaotic period, but there's also a time of great opportunity. Think about who we are, what India should be. We'll be better prepared for the world that is emerging. That's why stories, that's why culture, that's why civilization is so important. One should not be insufficiently imagined. We should keep thinking about who we are, keep debating. And just one last point, if I may be allowed to make, if there's just one suggestion I can give to all of you, at a time of geopolitical chaos like this, the worst thing we can do is have a lack of unity. We will have our debates, we'll have our discussions, wo sab kariye. But at a time like this, if we have internal, and Indians keep having internal divisions, caste ke upar, religion ke upar, language ke upar, religion ke upar, so many, gender ke upar, kisi na kisi issue pe we keep fighting with each other. If we do that at this time, there's this lovely Urdu sher, लम्हों ने खता की सजियों ने सजा पाई. People have heard that. If we make that mistake at this time, our generations will suffer, our children and grandchildren will suffer. We should have our debates, but realize one thing. If we Indians are united, कोई माई का लाल हमें रोक नहीं सकता है from becoming a strong power. कोई हमें नहीं रोक सकता है. The only ones who will defeat us Indians are we Indians ourselves. We shouldn't be divided. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amish ji. And I think you have also wonderfully keyed in the question I wanted to begin with. I wanted to begin with a different question, and that is, can such an identity or culture exist independent of power? I mean, definitely our culture is defined by Ano Bhadraha Kratvo Yantu Vishwataha. But at another time, it is also saying Dharmo Rakshati Rakshitaha. So, what is this identity? What are we protecting? And does this dharmic identity define ourselves? I would request Ambassador Varma to open the panel discussion, because you also say in your book that culture and identity is the dominant agenda in the 21st century. So what are your thoughts on this?
What was your question?
My question is, can culture exist independent of power?
Personally, I feel that in Indian culture has often existed independent of power. Because उसको सनातन इसलिए कहते हैं कि लोग आएं, लोग जाएं, पर that cultural identity which defines an Indian, that remains. I remember, again, Amish is a very distinguished successor to me as director of the Nehru Center in London. I was the first foreign service officer, political appointment then, on Atal Bihari Vajpayee's insistence that I became. So you have get many experiences when you are in the Nehru Center. So I met someone, so I said, the question came on identity and culture. And that is an example that I often quote. He said, मैं अगर अमृतसर से if I go to Chandigarh, तो चंडीगढ़ वाले मुझे अमृतसरी कहते हैं. But from Chandigarh if I come to Delhi, दिल्ली में मुझे पंजाबी कहते हैं. But दिल्ली से मैं जब लंदन आया हूं तो मुझे इंडियन कहते हैं. तो you are an Indian. And that culture doesn't leave you. इसको समझना है, because often we make the mistake. I'll take another 30 seconds. We think the world has become a global village. अब हम सब वही पढ़ते हैं, देखते हैं, खाते हैं, Kentucky, McDonald's, CNN, whatever, and we have become like each other. But no, cultures are not. Once I was eating with a few ambassadors in Delhi. अब खाना था, the food was Indian rotis, तंदूरी चिकन, दाल, सब्जी. वो बेचारे बहुत कोशिश कर रहे थे eating with a knife and fork. Try to cut a chapati with a knife and fork and you'll understand why you are Indian and they can never be. So finally I told them that देखिए हम जब खाना खाते हैं हम जाके अपना हाथ धोते फिर उसको तोड़ के खाते हैं. All of them got up, washed their hands and began to eat because they realized that there is a difference in cultures. So don't make the mistake of believing that cultures need to be defended always by power. Yes, they need to be often backed by power, and a power can eclipse them momentarily, as happened during the colonial period. I mentioned it. But was that eclipsed? You cannot kill a fly with a sword. ये तो भाई ये तो एक समूह है, एक झुंड है, एक सोच है. How do you kill an idea with a sword? So that's why I don't believe that happens.
So taking it a little...
May I
Sure,
respond to
sure.
that? Your question is, can culture exist independent of power? Perhaps it's a good idea to understand where this question is coming from, because it may or may not be stemming from any emic or indic understandings of how culture or even power operates. It is essentially the post-structuralist movement followed by materialism, the materialist historiography, that has somewhere made this question the norm, to read power into everything, right? Now, power and culture may or may not coexist, but certainly do not reduce culture to power. And that is essentially what historical theories of these kinds have done. They have reduced all cultural production to purposes of power. So if a temple was built, or if a sculpture was commissioned, or a work of poetry was written, it was done to always legitimize the king, or legitimize the social order, hierarchy, blah, blah. Whereas when you actually read Indian cultural productions, when you actually read our Sanskrit texts, for example, the area that I specialize in, you find a polyphony, you find multiple voices, you find very critical voices, voices critical of power of all kinds, ritual power, gender, politics, and mind you, these are poets who were possibly in the court of the king and yet were unafraid to question and expose him. That is the extent of power of culture that we are really talking about. So what I argue for in all my work is actually restoring to culture its agency, which is that please let's read Indic culture on its own terms rather than reducing it to something else.
So in an oblique manner, could I say that maybe you're also speaking about how culture, when it is with the people or practiced by the people, maybe that's where the agency or power in that sense of culture should lie. But I'm taking this question to you, Amish ji, who has, I think, very successfully brought our culture into the dominant narratives that are popular. I would say that we often talk about disruptors in the context of technology, but I think in Indian English fiction, probably you must be one of the great disruptors, because we no longer need our superheroes from Marvel or DC Comics. I think he gave us our superheroes, he gave us fan clubs around our own mythologies and our histories, and probably none of us who earlier associated reading our myths or so-called religious texts, we associated it with those yellowing, dusty tomes lying somewhere in a corner of the home, only brought out when we have to perform some rituals we may or may not understand. And suddenly now the word bestseller is being associated with that. So I would like to understand from you, how do you think culture refracts, or our mythology refracts, when it is brought into the domain of the popular? Do the dictates of the marketplace have a certain effect or influence on the way you tell those stories? And also, I would bring back the same question to you, that is, when you write something like the Chola Tigers, do you agree with this assessment that preservation of culture is possible without it being allied to a power center, specifically political power?
Two separate questions in that. One is the stories on our epics. The second is historical fiction. On the stories of our epics, I think the way our culture was is that whatever your skill contribution may be to the society, it could be warrior skills, it could be business skills, could be intellectual skills, storytelling skills, artistic skills. If those skills do not have the ankush of dharma, then you get on the wrong path. If you're a great warrior, but you are not reined in by dharma, you become a predator. If you are a businessman who is not reined in by dharma, you'll not earn money to do good with it. You'll destroy everything to earn money, like arguably many American businessmen, American bankers did do, right? They destroyed their country just to make money because there wasn't that reign of Dharma. I think it's the same with storytelling, intellectual skills, that you don't write such stories because of what you're thinking the market would like or not like. When I started writing, I mean, my first book was published in 2010. Wasn't really fashionable to write such books in those days. I'd gone to Jaipur Lit Fest. I think the first time I was invited was in 2011. I'd met Pavan K the first time out there. I remember I'd said on stage that I'm a very proud Hindu in 2011 in Jaipur Lit Fest, and everyone had just frozen up. And at that time, if I was thinking about the market, I probably wouldn't have written a book like this. I just wrote what felt right to me dharmically, right? Time and the audiences decide which will succeed, which will not. There are many throughout history who have written on the stories of our epics. And many of them are respectful reinterpretations. Look at the works of Bhasa, for example. And how many of you have read the works of Bhasa, Sanskrit? Yeah, obviously. Yeah, very few. Yeah, this is very sad. Please, just read them. Translations are available. According to Kalidas ji, Bhasa was the greatest Sanskrit playwright. So the play like Pancharatra, the war of the Mahabharata didn't happen only in that version. And Bhasa, the greatest Sanskrit playwright, he did a respectful reinterpretation. It was a very popular play. But my thing is that you let time and audiences decide. As long as you do a respectful dharmic interpretation, that's how you should approach that. Historical fiction, you're essentially interpreting facts of history to write a story which can appeal to today. That's what, and it's a genre that's been around for centuries. Now, if you're going to twist facts, like if Mughal-e-Azam was made with Akbar fighting Alauddin Khilji, that is wrong, right? But Mughal-e-Azam was historical fiction in the sense that there's no real evidence there was an Anarkali. Salim was not this great general. Actually, he was a drugged out moron, right? The problem between him and Akbar was a very capable father stuck with a completely idiot son. That was the real problem, right? But that, if you're adjusting, then it's historical fiction. So, in Chola Tigers, essentially, I showed an assassination squad that Emperor Rajen Chola sent to Ghazni to kill Mahmud for the crime that he did at Somnathji. Did both of them exist at the same time? Yes. Was Emperor Rajen Chola the most powerful man on earth at that time? Yes. Was he a very, very devout Shiv Bhakt? Yes. Is there some doubts, controversies about how Mahmud Ghazni died? Yes. So I have fitted in a narrative which fits into the facts the way it is. That's what historical fiction is. You take the facts as they are and make it very clear, bhai, I'm writing fiction. I make that clear at the beginning of the book. This is fiction, right? And then communicate facts about suggestions for India today. Like my theme that I keep saying, we must be united. So that assassination squad has Indians from all parts of India, Hindus and Muslims, going to kill Mahmud as vengeance, right? When we Indians are united, no one can beat us.
So that's a wonderful response.
Could I just briefly come in?
Sure, please.
In fact, I think as a literature, as someone who writes self-avowedly professional, popular fiction, historical fiction, I think it's possibly a little easier, and the burden and the challenge of actually reaching the masses lies much more heavily on the professional historian. Because how do you at least have the genre available to you that allows you to speak in a tongue and in a mode, namely storytelling, which is by definition accessible to the masses. But as historians, many of us feel actually from time to time rather frustrated that how do we get historical correctives out to the masses? How do we get India's such powerful historical truths out to the masses, and yet doing so in a way that does not dumb down our history, so retaining the rigor of authentic, original research. So Pavanji earlier said that we were the originals, we were not photocopies. So in the same way, our original Sanskrit texts and epics and stories, as Amish said, very few people are reading them today, and I think that will remain a tragedy no matter how successful popular historical fiction gets.
Two comments quickly on what Amit said. No, I think your question about culture and power, Cholas are a classic example. A powerful kingdom run well, and the maximum expansion of Indian culture beyond India took place under the Cholas. Right up the whole of Southeast Asia. Peaceful, but backed by power. So in that sense, there is a connection. Secondly, आपने जो अभी जिक्र किया धर्म का, ना धर्म जो है ना, इसे एक चीज मैं आप लोगों को कहता हूँ, culture in the Indian context is never simple. It's very complex. We have 4 purusharths, highest purusharth, dharma, artha, kama, moksha. I know no other culture, no religion which gives this Confucian, more than Confucian balance. But we don't have the 10 commandments. We have in our Christian minority, but in the Sanatan Dharma, धर्म की कभी भी एक ही परिभाषा नहीं है. कुछ इंडिकेशन है कि ये चीजें मनुस्मृति में मिलेगी जो 10 वर्च्यूज मेंशन्ड है कि ये धर्म हो सकता है. But there is no absolute definition because we have the courage of saying कि depending on circumstance, this could be right or wrong. ये बहुत ही important चीज है. और मैं कहता हूं कि महाभारत से तो ओपन टेक्स्ट ही नहीं है, उसको तो कंपल्सरीली पढ़ना चाहिए. महाभारत जिसपे अमीश ने काम किया, when Draupadi questions Dharmaraj after he interprets Kunti's comment कि share between you what you have won, and महाभारत कहती है lust singed the eyes of the other brothers on the prospective interpretation of her comment. But Draupadi, strong woman. We have many strong women also, although there has been great gender exploitation in this country, also justified in the name of culture, by the way, very often. But Draupadi asks Dharmaraj, this is against dharma. It is against custom. It is against usage. So Dharmaraj says, O Draupadi, Dharma is sukshma, subtle. Who has defined it? This pleases me, so it must be right. These are the exact words of Dharmaraj in the verbatim text of the Mahabharata. All I'm trying to say is that I fully understand the context in which you used it, but in our culture, even dharma requires application of mind. It's not blind following. Thank you.
So I think, could we proceed then from understanding culture in terms of identity or power? And I think we can sum up and probably give Professor Kaul some few minutes to speak about Sanskrit and language, like you earlier said.
Sure.
So could you contextualize it within this, that could we then talk about culture or dharma as a consciousness that we share rather than giving it an adjective, giving it a name, or trying to reduce it to an identity? And what is the role of Sanskrit in creating that consciousness?
So I'm going to work in reverse order with your questions. Can we call dharma a consciousness? So I, in my own research across multiple texts, came to the realization that I too needed a new definition or description of what dharma is compared to what has been given to it in English literature generally, in the usage of English words: religion, righteous order, duty, justice. These are the kind of translations you get for the term dharma. And yet it is fundamentally and non-translatable. That's kind of what people have concluded today. But where do we go from here? Is it actually non-translatable? Can we not talk about it? So I came up with a definition of dharma as a critical idealism. Because that is indeed what I found my authors, my poets, the authors of the Sanskrit Kavyas I was working with, talking about dharma as. So when you give it something like a definition like critical idealism, you're actually leaving the floor open, both for contextuality, which is what is dharma in what context could very well vary, What is Dharma for whom could also very much vary. So what A.K. Ramanujan epically called a context sensitivity defines Indic culture. And Dharma is a brilliant example of how that works. But I want to kind of broaden this out, the observations that both Amish and Pavan were making about Dharma or about the Mahabharata. I want to say that this is a problem that all of Sanskrit literature faces. And this is partly the reason also why we have the tragedy I was talking about just before this, that most of us don't even bother to read the originals. You talked about how these original Sanskrit texts and manuscripts are lying in dusty corners of archives here and there. Why? Because we have been culturally disembedded. That is, we have been taught to believe that Sanskrit as a whole, and not just this text here or that text there, as a whole, is an elitist production that had nothing to do with the masses or with society as a whole, and that was composed merely to reproduce power, to reproduce hierarchy in society and to maintain hierarchy, and that was the total job. In other words, Sanskrit has been much maligned today as a language of only either ritual, so nothing to do with our secular sensibilities, quote unquote, or a language of repression. That is ensuring social subjugation of certain classes by certain others who had monopoly, blah, blah, blah. The reason I'm detailing this is because when you actually begin to study the language and the literary culture associated with Sanskrit, you find that all of these are in fact untruths. None of these hold and apply when you begin to look at what I earlier called the polyphony, the multiple voices in which even a single Sanskrit text speaks. We again think, like multiculturalism, we think dissent, debate, these are modern qualities, how enlightened of us in the 21st century. In fact, these are qualities that we have been practicing for 3,000 or 4,000 years. All our even Shastras would have typically a Purva Paksha and an Uttara Paksha, which is nothing but prior theories and opinions and the response of the particular author to them. So there is a fundamental dialogic character to all our Sanskrit literature, and it fundamentally problematizes what is right and what is wrong. It doesn't give you dogma of any kind. So Sanskrit is not dogmatic, it is not hierarchy-ridden, it is not elitist, it is not pro-power, it is actually a very critical and dynamic literary culture, and really it is time to stop making excuses for not reading the originals anymore.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session and really setting the tone. This could be a 24-hour conversation and still not be enough. Thank you so much for joining us, being a wonderful audience, and I hope this sets the tone for the 3 days to come. Thank you again. Thank you for joining.